Good evening all and welcome. I need to warn you all before watching that a handful of these stories are extremely graphic and disturbing, and if you are squeamish, it's time to pick another video. But if you're still here, it's time to get extremely uncomfortable and let the darkness take control. A paramedic friend once told me a story that still makes my stomach turn. He warned me before starting, and I'm warning you. This one's bad. They had been dispatched to check on an unconscious man slumped over on a park bench, near an area notorious for heavy drug use. It was the kind of place where paramedics were called every single night. ODs, fights, and people wasting away in the shadows. When they arrived, the first thing that hit them was the smell. It was more than just the usual stench of unwashed skin and old sweat. This was something deeper, something rotting. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes and burrows into your sinuses long after you've gone. The man was barely responsive. Weak pulse, shallow breathing. He was emaciated, his skin hanging off his bones, his lips cracked and dry. He had no shoes, just plastic bags tied around his feet, with what looked like string, a crude attempt at warmth or protection. They carefully moved him to the ground to assess him. That's when they noticed something very wrong. His legs from the knee down were pitch black, not bruised, not dirty, black. The skin looked leathery and dead. His feet were bloated, almost swollen to twice their normal size, with unnatural stiffness. At first, they thought it was just extreme necrosis from untreated infection, something they had unfortunately seen before in long-time IV drug users. But when they peeled back one of the plastic bags, just enough to get a better look, the true horror began. The plastic had melted into his flesh. Where the bag had been pressing against his skin, it had fused with the decaying tissue. The thin plastic was now an inseparable part of his rotting legs. And then movement. As they pulled the bag away, the skin beneath it rippled, and a wave of maggots spilled out, cascading down his feet like grains of rice, twisting and writhing, feeding. The paramedics jumped back, gagging. One of them managed to barely turn away before vomiting into the bushes, and the other one stood frozen, unable to look away. More and more of the larvae pushed their way out of open sores, burrowed deep inside the decaying flesh. The entire lower half of his legs was alive with them. Somewhere in the background, a radio crackled. A voice asked for a status update, but neither of them answered right away. Because what do you even say? The man barely reacted, his body beyond pain, beyond saving. He had been rotting alive for God knows how long, oblivious to the fact his legs had become a feeding ground. By the time they got him to the ambulance, the only thing left to do was transport him to the hospital, knowing full well he'd probably never make it out. To this day, my friend swears the smell followed him home, and no matter how much he scrubbed, no matter how long he stood under scalding water, he could still feel it in his nose, the scent of death, decay, and the countless tiny things writhing underneath that dead man's skin. I work nights in the locked unit of our nursing home. It's where the most difficult patients are: advanced dementia, severe behavioral issues, and mental illness. The people that no one else wants to deal with. The wing itself is unsettling, a long dark hallway isolated on the top floor of a massive 3-story building. Once the doors lock behind me, it's just me and the patients. There's an oppressive stillness, like the place is holding its breath. No one likes working back here, especially at night. It's not just difficult patients, there's something else. Something that doesn't feel quite right. Let me elaborate. One night I was making my rounds when I heard a man's voice call out as clear as day. "Hey, come over here." It came from the dead end of the hallway, but there were no men in that section, and all my patients were asleep. No TVs, no radios, no logical explanation. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. When I mentioned it the next day, A co-worker got real quiet. She told me there used to be a patient in that exact room, and he'd call out for help in that very same way. And he had died right before I started. She even described his voice. It was a perfect match. Then there was what I like to call the shush. We had a resident once, a bitter, mean old woman who loved barking orders at people. She'd tell others to speak up or shut up, depending on her mood. After she passed, I didn't think much of her. One night I was standing in the hallway, talking with my husband. He works in another unit of the same building. We were mid-conversation when a loud, sharp shush cut through the air. It was right next to us. We spun around, but the hallway was empty. I swear to this day it sounded just like her. There was another woman who we moved into a shared room with another resident. They never got along. Her new roommate would swing at her if she took food off her plate, curse her for speaking too loudly. Not long after moving in, she died in that room. And after that, her roommate changed overnight. This was a woman who had always loved her privacy, preferred to be left alone, but now she was terrified to sleep in that room. She'd beg us not to turn off the lights, refuse to get into bed, and when she finally did, she'd wake up screaming. One night I found her in the hallway, walking without her wheelchair, gripping the walls for balance and trembling. She was out of breath, eyes wild with terror. When I tried to lead her back, she fought me. There was pure fear in her expression, something deep and primal, like she had seen something she couldn't explain. For a month she refused to sleep in that room. It only stopped when she was moved elsewhere. The general theory? Her dead roommate wasn't quite done with her. Now, in the hospital where we work, there is a theory that people see their loved ones before they die. I've seen it over and over, patients talking to people who aren't there, reaching for invisible hands, laughing, crying, and whispering. That is how you know it's coming. When they start speaking to family members who've already passed, it's only a matter of time. We were dealing with another woman. My colleague walked in and asked who she was talking to, as she was animatedly having a conversation with absolutely nothing in the corner of the room. She was very happy to say, "Look, it's my sister Jean. She's come to take me." My colleague risked another glance into the empty corner and smiled and said, "Oh, that's nice," and walked out the room. Within a few hours, she was dead. There are also the call bells. Not the kind that would be triggered by accident. These are the ones that have to be physically pulled down to activate. You know, with force. And they don't turn off unless someone pushes them back up. Sometimes they go off in locked rooms. There's never anyone there. And honestly, it happens mostly after someone has passed away. Almost like they want one more bit of assistance before they move on. This is the part that scares me the most. At the far end of my hall, there's a Greek woman who doesn't speak English. Some nights she'll start barking up a storm, her voice rising and falling like she's having a full-blown conversation. But when I go in to check on her, she stops pretending to be asleep, and the moment I walk away, she'll start again. This will go on for a while until she finally falls silent, and then the woman in the next room will start doing the same thing. Then the one across the hall. Each of them one after another, as if something is going room to room waking them up. And it's always the same phrases. "The man was in my room. The man is standing in the corner behind you. The man told me to." None of them know what the others are saying. None of them should be able to repeat the exact same thing, but they do. It happens again and again. I wonder who the hell he is and what he says to them. But, in truth, I don't think I want to find out. I was working an evening shift in the ER when I got the call. "Infectious patient from 14. That was already a really bad sign. Room 14 was one of the isolation rooms usually reserved for grotesquely infected abscesses, foul-smelling gangrene, or other nightmarish conditions that require containment. The nurse briefing me looked pale.
It's an older man, bilateral venous ulcers. They're infected. And...
She hesitated, her lips pressing into a tight line.
He hasn't changed his dressing in about 10 months.
I stared at her. She shook her head, and a cold weight settled in my stomach. I flipped through his chart. No medical visits in about a year. No follow-up, nothing. I side-suited up and walked into the room, and the stench was the first thing that hit me. It was the overwhelming stench of rot, an unholy mixture of stale beer, mold, and something wet and sulfuric, like meat left to fester in the heat. It clung to my nostrils, thick and oppressive, and it made me nearly gag. The man sat on the examining table, looking annoyed. His clothes were stiff with grime. His skin had a greyish, unhealthy pallor. He told me that he didn't know why he was here, and that he had his leg seen to last year. Just some antibiotics and he'll be on his way. I told him I needed to have a look. The dressings on his legs were ancient, stiff with layers of dried fluid and filth. As I peeled the first one back, it crackled, breaking apart like old parchment. And beneath it, the bandage turned a sickly yellow, then a deep brown, soaked through with filth of a wound left untouched for nearly a year. The smell that erupted from underneath was indescribable. One of the nurses gagged and bolted from the room. I forced myself to keep going, my breath now shallow and through my mouth. But that only made things worse. Then I saw it. Something was wiggling inside a deep fold of his rotting flesh. A single, plump maggot, pale and glistening, twisting lazily in the raw tissue. I swallowed hard and continued rapping. The deeper we went, the worse it got. Dozens, no, hundreds of maggots, feeding. They squirmed and burrowed deep into the meat of his leg. White, writhing things nestled inside the pockets of this necrotic flesh. They spilled out as we peeled away the last of the bandages, plopping wetly on the table and the floor and onto my gloved hands. I felt something crawl over my shoe. The other nurse who had just re-entered the room turned green and fled. I turned to his other leg, dreading what I would find. That was worse. The ulcer had eaten deep, exposing sinew and tendon, glistening like raw meat in a butcher's shop. The infection had turned the surrounding skin into something mottled and unnatural, oozing pus in thick yellow rivulets, and inside more maggots, thriving and feasting within. At that moment, I understood. True rot. We had to clean him up immediately. We gathered the maggots in a metal bowl, but they kept moving. Some tumbling onto the floor, crawling over our boots and writhing blindly in the search for new flesh. I felt them squirming too close to my exposed wrist and fought the urge to shudder. We hosed him down before sending him to surgery, striping away the rotting, maggot-infested flesh until only viable tissue remained. Then he was fitted with vacuum dressings to suck out the infection. We discharged him a few days later with strict follow-ups, knowing full well that if he didn't take care of himself, he'd be in a much worse state than he was in now. And we never saw him again. I was 21 when this happened. After an attempt on my life by OD, I woke up in a hospital in the middle of the night. The room was dim, lit by only the cold glow of the monitors around me. I was groggy, weak and disoriented, my body aching from the inside out. That's when I noticed a nurse standing over me. He was tall, thin, with his face half hidden by the low light, with no name tag and no introduction, just a soft, clinical voice saying, "I need to replace your IV." I barely had the strength to nod. He took my arm and jabbed a needle into my skin. Sharp pain, no vein. He tried again and missed, and again, and again. By the fourth attempt, I winced and whispered, Could you get someone else to do it?" My voice felt paper thin, like it would be swallowed by the silence around us. "No," he said flatly, pushing another needle in. He wasn't just missing, he was digging, twisting the needle beneath my skin, searching for a vein that he wasn't even trying to hit, sliding it in and out, wiggling it inside. The pain became something deeper, sharper, and intentional. Something in my gut turned cold. By the seventh or eighth needle, the realization hit me like a weight on my chest. He was doing this on purpose. I locked eyes with him, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't hesitate. He didn't smirk, he didn't sneer. Didn't try to justify himself. He simply said, "It's your own fault you're here." Something about the way he said it, so calm and detached that it made my stomach twist. I was too weak to fight back, too exhausted to even move my arm away. And it was the middle of the night. There was no one else around, no footsteps in the hall, no voices at the nurse's station, just the soft beep of the monitors and the burning pain in my arm. I lost count of the amount of times he tried to pierce my skin, how long he spent hurting me. By the time he finally left, my arm was throbbing, swollen, and a mess of puncture and bruises. The next day, a different nurse came in to remove the IV, and she gasped the moment she saw it. "Oh my God, what the hell is this?" She held up the IV catheter, her face pale. "It's the biggest needle I've ever seen used on a living patient." I don't know why she specified living. I didn't want to know. A lot of people shrug this off when I tell them about it, that maybe he was just bad at IVs, or it was probably an accident. But they weren't there. They didn't see his face or hear his voice. They didn't feel what it felt like to be alone and helpless at the mercy of someone who was supposed to care for you, but instead wants to hurt you. So, yeah, night nurse who loves huge needles and hates mentally ill girls. Let's not meet again. I work as a paramedic, and on this night, I got a call that I will never forget. As the youth of today say, it lives in my head rent-free, much to my regret. The call was, "Traffic accident. Baby ejected." Those are the kind of words that set your heart pounding before you even hit the lights. We braced for the worst, running through every possible horror in our mind as we sped towards the scene. 8 minutes felt like an eternity, and when we arrived, a state trooper was already there, his patrol car angled across the road, red and blue strobes throwing frantic shadows against the trees. He was working to push back a growing crowd of bystanders, their faces pale, their hands covering their mouths. The trooper had already covered the baby with the yellow death sheet they carry in their trunks. We ran towards it. I was expecting the small, lifeless body of an infant, but when we lifted the sheet, the breath left my lungs. It wasn't a baby. It was the top half of a young woman. Her face was still, eyes open, lips slightly parted, as if she was about to say something. Below the ribs, there was nothing. Just torn muscle, exposed vertebrae, and a long, dark smear trailing down the pavement, marking the violent path of her body. She had been driving a small pickup truck. Her husband had been in the passenger seat, and witnesses told us they were arguing. The truck was moving around 55 down a 2-lane road when they met an oncoming semi hauling a double-wide mobile home. She never saw it coming. The front corner of the mobile home caught the cab of the truck, peeling the top like a can opener, severing her at the waist. The truck kept going, tires screeching, metal screaming against the asphalt. It swiped a minivan, sending it tumbling into a ditch upside down. The pickup skidded another 50, maybe 60 yards before finally coming to rest. Her lower half was still in the driver's seat when it stopped. A moment later, it fell out onto the pavement. The aftermath was gruesome beyond words. A trail of ribs, shredded muscle, and torn organs stretched from the cab to the bed and then down the road where her torso had landed. It looked unreal, like a scene from a horror film, but the smell of blood and hot pavement made it all too real. And her husband, he had been right there, sitting right next to her when it happened, untouched but very much not unharmed. He had seen everything. When we arrived, he was in a state of pure hysteria. His brain had shattered under the weight of what his eyes had just witnessed. He was running in circles and babbling, wildly swinging at anyone who got too close. His hands were streaked with blood. Whether his or hers, we don't know. We had to restrain him before he hurt himself or someone else. A man who had been standing in front of the crash site, a local who had seen it all unfold, clutched his chest and collapsed. We had to transport him for a suspected heart attack. Meanwhile, the driver of the semi, who had done nothing wrong, stood off to the side, hands shaking, breath shallow, staring at the wreckage like he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. His face was a mask of quiet horror, the kind that sinks deep and never leaves. Medical control authorized us to give the husband IV Valium, an extreme measure normally reserved for grand mal seizures, but necessary here. His mind had snapped, and I think we knew that no amount of medication could piece it back together. This was 16 years ago, and yet I could still close my eyes and see it like it happened yesterday. I worked in the dementia unit of a retirement home for a while, and I can say that without a doubt, it was one of the most fascinating and unsettling jobs I've ever had. It was heartbreaking in many ways, of course, but some things people don't often realize is that we, as caregivers, never knew our residents before the disease. We didn't know them as sharp, vibrant individuals. We only knew them as they were now, fragmented, lost in the fog of Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, yet still very much human, still needing love, still clinging to whatever pieces of them remained. But dementia units are strange places. The mind is a fragile thing, and when it begins to break, it can let in things that rational people like to pretend don't exist. Every day, eerie and inexplicable things happened. Residents reacting to invisible presences, laughing at unseen jokes, recoiling in terror from empty spaces. But the experience that has haunted me the most was what happened with Nancy. Nancy had advanced Alzheimer's, so advanced that she hadn't spoken a coherent word in nearly a year. She was a pacer, meaning she wandered the halls endlessly, circling the unit like a restless spirit, never stopping unless we guided her to eat or sleep. Attempts to engage her were usually fruitless. She barely acknowledged us, never made eye contact, and just kept walking. There was a vacancy in her gaze, a silent mechanical rhythm to her movement, like something unseen was pulling her forward. Nancy's husband, Wayne, lived in the assisted living section of our facility. He visited her every day without fail, even when she gave no signs of recognizing him. 60 years of marriage, 60 years of shared life was enough to keep him coming. But then Wayne fell ill, too sick to leave his room. His daily visits stopped. We worried about what it would mean for Nancy, even though she showed no outward reaction to his absence. Still, I like to believe that deep down, some part of her was waiting for him. Wayne died one early morning. Per facility policy, we didn't tell Nancy. What good would it do? She didn't understand. At least, that's what we thought. That evening, something changed.
Nancy was pacing as usual when she suddenly froze, her entire body tense. Her head snapped upwards and her eyes locked into the corner of the ceiling with an intensity I had never seen before. She was completely still, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and then she started screaming. Now, screaming isn't uncommon in dementia units, but this wasn't the confused panic wailing we were used to. This was raw terror, a gut-wrenching animalistic shriek that sent chills down everyone's spines in the room. We ran to her expecting some kind of medical emergency, but she wasn't in pain. She wasn't even moving. She was just staring, pupils dilated, face twisted in horror. And then, as clear as day, she spoke. Remember, she hadn't spoken in almost a year. Wayne, 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 over and over, her voice rising and falling like an eerie little chant. I placed a hand on her arm, gently trying to calm her. Nancy? For the first time since I'd known her, she looked directly at me. Not through me, not past me. At me. Her pale, watery eyes locked onto mine, and in them I saw something lucid, something aware. He's bothering me, she said, her voice steady. Tell him to leave me alone. She then turned her head and returned to look to the ceiling. Go away, Wayne. Half of the staff bolted from the room, leaving the rest of us frozen in place, caught between disbelief and a bone-deep fear we couldn't rationalize away. After that night, Nancy changed. She began speaking again, not often and never full sentences, but enough that we noticed. She'd mutter to herself, whisper under her breath. Her words half-formed, fragmented. And more often than not, she was talking to someone. Sometimes in the dead of night, we'd find her sitting up in bed, eyes locked on the same spot in the ceiling, nodding, listening, and responding in hushed tones. And sometimes, very occasionally, she would laugh. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl. The fact that this didn't start happening until the day her husband died gives me the serious creeps.
It started as a normal shift in the emergency department. Afternoon chaos. Ambulances arriving, machines beeping, families crying in the hallways, and in the middle of it all, an elderly woman slumped in a wheelchair calling out, "Help me!" over and over. She had been dumped on us by her nursing home, brought in for what they called agitation, which usually meant, we can't handle her anymore. She was frail, pale, and restless. Her paper-thin skin clung to her sharp bones, her eyes wild and desperate. A carer was assigned to keep her calm and help her eat while the rest of us moved on to other patients. And then it happened. I was walking past when she suddenly gasped a deep, unnatural inhalation and collapsed backwards like a puppet with its strings cut. Her frail body seized and her eyes rolled back. I slammed the emergency button. Alarms blared and footsteps thundered in all directions. Within seconds, the room was filled with help. Someone asked what happened. "Possible aspiration," I shouted. She'd been mid-bite when she collapsed. We thought she'd choked. A male nurse pressed his fingers to her throat and declared no pulse. Someone checked her airways, and they were clear. But she wasn't breathing, her lips were going blue. So we started compressions. Someone locked their hands together and began pounding her chest. And that's when it happened. A sickening, gurgling noise rose from deep within her, wet and thick, and then her mouth erupted. A geyser of green-black slime shot out. An arc of putrid, foul-smelling liquid spattered across the wall, the floor, and the ceiling, and all over us. The nurse doing compression staggered back, dripping in it, but he had to keep going. His hands, coated in slime, kept slamming on her chest, forcing more of the rancid liquid out in a rhythmic, nauseating burst. Someone else screamed, and someone else gagged. The stench hit a second later. a revolting mix of rot, infection, and raw sewage. It clung to the back of my throat, thick and heavy, and I had to fight my own urge not to vomit. We tried to suction her airway, but the more we pulled out, the more kept pouring from her like a human drain pipe. Liters of it. The tube filled almost instantly, clogging it with murky, viscous sludge that sloshed and bubbled as we emptied it. 6 liters of pure decay. Her body jerked violently with every compression, forcing more of the toxic filth from her. The floor was now slick with it. And then, finally, the doctor called it. Time of death. We stepped back, panting and coated in something that should have never been inside a human body. It wasn't until later that we learnt the truth. The poor woman had a massive bowel obstruction. Her intestines had rotted from the inside out. The built-up waste slowly poisoned her body. When she arrived mid-meal, the force of CPR had ruptured her gut, sending days, maybe weeks of backed-up fecal matter surging out through her mouth. She had literally vomited her own filth to death. The ER bay was unusable for hours, and even after scrubbing the floors, the smell persisted, hanging in the air like a rotting corpse left in the sun. That night I stood in the shower for over an hour, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, but I still couldn't make the smell leave.
About 9 months ago, I started working as a hospital security guard at a major hospital in my city. It's easily the most exciting and rewarding job I've ever had. Every shift brings something new, whether it's handling trespassers, assisting with mental health patients, or searching for missing individuals. I've made great friends, gathered countless stories, and truly understand the expression, if you love your job, you never work a day in your life. But tonight, I'm not here to talk about the usual chaos of hospital security. I want to talk about the paranormal. Even before I started, I was intrigued by the idea of a hospital being a hotspot for paranormal activity. With people passing away here daily, wouldn't it make sense? I wish I could say I've seen ghosts roaming the halls or bodies moving in the morgue, but nothing that extreme has happened. Still, I do have something to share. The hospital consists of 4 main buildings that security covers. The main hospital, where the ER and over 1,000 beds are, which is always busy. The medical clinic, an 8-story building across the street, typically staffed by just 1 guard. The cancer clinic, requiring 2 guards 24/7. And the old clinic, known to us as the asbestos clinic. This last building is where things get unsettling. You see, the asbestos clinic should have been demolished years ago. During my first walkthrough, a fellow guard casually mentions the building was haunted. A young girl had taken her own life on the 2nd floor. And the basement, that was even worse. Back in the 50s and 60s, this place had been a TB sanatorium, complete with underground tunnels to transport bodies. About a month ago, I was assigned to cover the clinic on a night shift. I had done countless patrols there before, but nothing too strange had ever happened, except for the elevators randomly opening on their own, which my co-worker shrugged off as normal. That night, though, things were different. At around 3 a.m., I started my usual patrol. The clinic closes early around 8 p.m., and should have been completely empty. But as I walked around the building's exterior checking the doors, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. One of the side doors was open. I knew for a fact that it had been closed earlier in my shift. With no cameras inside, my only option was to go in and check every single room. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and started methodically clearing the 1st floor. The hallways were silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Room after room, empty. Then, just as I was about to check the elevator, I heard it. A door creaking open. It was slow and deliberate. I immediately radioed my team lead, letting her know I'd found an open door and was hearing noises. She sent Fred, a fellow guard from the cancer clinic, to assist me. We decided to split up. Fred would take the 3rd and 4th floors while I covered the 2nd and basement. As I moved through the 2nd floor, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. This time it was closer. I radioed Fred and asked him to join me. At this point, I wasn't thinking paranormal. We'd all had break-ins before, usually just homeless people looking for shelter. We swept the entire second floor. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no movement, just silence. After another search of the whole building, we confirmed that no one was inside. Fred returned to the cancer clinic, and my team lead, half-jokingly, said it was probably just a ghost. That's when I decided that if it was a ghost, I wanted to see it. Determined, I went back inside this time, alone, and sat on the second floor. I waited. 10 minutes passed and there was nothing. The basement of the asbestos clinic is another level of eerie. The tunnels, long, empty corridors leading to nowhere, are relics from when the building was a TB hospital, but most are now sealed, but one remained open, and it stretched into the darkness. As soon as I stepped into the tunnel, my radio lost signal, which is not uncommon for basements, but it still made me uneasy. I kept walking. The further I went in, the colder it felt. My breath hung in the air, and that's when I heard it. A blood-curdling female scream. It came from behind me near the entrance of the tunnel. I spun around, heart pounding, pointing my dimming flashlight into the darkness, but no one was there. I bolted back towards the entrance, and as I reached the main basement, I noticed something even more unsettling. The door was open. The door that was supposed to be locked. Only security had the keys. I stepped inside and looked around. Nothing. But the air was thick with an awful rotting stench that I immediately recognized. One of decomposition. Once I made it back upstairs, I regained radio signal, called my team lead, and she sent back Fred to help me investigate. We looked in the basement together. The room was still open and the stench was even stronger, but there was nothing. Friend made a dark joke about how the room might have been used for tuberculosis patients who didn't make it, but neither of us knew for sure. What I do know is that ever since that night, I rush my basement patrols. That awful smell still lingers every time I pass the room, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something or someone was down there with me.
A nurse once told me about the night she was floated onto the oncology ward at the hospital where she used to work. It wasn't a unit she was familiar with, but she had done enough end-of-life care to know what to expect. The air in those rooms was always thick with grief, antiseptic, and the quiet, heavy presence of something no one could name, but everyone could feel. That night she was assigned a patient who was actively dying. The woman had been unconscious for days, her body clinging onto the last vestiges of life. Family had come and gone, whispered their goodbyes to someone who could no longer hear them, and the only sounds in the room were the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the slow rattling breaths of a body refusing to give in. It was the kind of night that dragged. Outside the hospital, the world was dark and silent. Inside, the oncology unit was quiet, except for the occasional shuffling of nurses' shoes and the low murmur of voices at the nurses' station. Nothing felt out of the ordinary, until she went to check on her patient. Stepping into the room, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The woman, who had been utterly still for days, was now sitting bolt upright in bed, her body rigid, pressed all the way against the headboard, her eyes cloudy and distant before, but now wide open and full of terror. The nurse barely had time to speak before the woman gasped out, "Don't let them take me!" The voice was raw and pleading. It wasn't the weak, fading whisper of a dying woman. It was desperate and forceful. The nurse froze, and a chill crept down her spine. Trying to stay calm, she stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on the patient's trembling arm. Who's trying to take you?" The woman's gaze didn't move from the ceiling, her breath hitched in her throat. Slowly, with a shaking hand, she raised one finger and pointed upwards. "The black thing." The nurse swallowed hard and instinctively followed the woman's gaze. The ceiling above them was just that, plain white ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. But something about the space felt wrong, heavy, as if something was there watching. The nurse turned back to the woman, but before she could speak, the patient let out a long, shuddering breath, her body suddenly limp, her hand falling back on the bed. The monitor flatlined. The room, which had felt so tense just seconds before, was now eerily, suffocatingly still. The nurse checked for a pulse, knowing already what she would find. Nothing. The patient was gone. But that horrible, oppressive feeling in the room, it wasn't. The nurse backed away slowly, heart hammering, a prickling sensation running up the back of her neck like unseen fingers brushing against her skin. She didn't stay in that room a second longer than she had to. I've worked in IT for a hospital system for the last 6 years. The hospital I'm working at now is a very old facility. The original building on the campus was built over 100 years ago. Now there are 9 buildings that vary in age from 100 to just 2 years old, and there are several auxiliary buildings that are rented to practice and used as administrative offices. The oldest building is where the creepiest stories are spread around by staff. For 4 of those years, I was a field tech, level 2 support, and a field tech lead. We had to be at the hospital Monday through Friday and had 24/7 on-call rotation on top of that. Even during the height of the pandemic, when the rest of the IT crowd got to work from home, we were there. Even before the negative emotions, pain, death, and suffering that skyrocketed during the pandemic, the first hospital I worked at definitely had its fair share of resident spirits. It was one of the medium-sized hospitals in this system. The freakiest thing was when we were helping convert the old ICU into the new cath lab. As soon as the nurse call vendor had the system installed, we started getting phantom calls to the nurses' station. Mind you, there were no patients in those rooms yet, and no staff working there. More than once, we had the project manager go running into a room to tell the technicians installing the PC to leave the call button alone, only to find no one working in that particular room. After it opened, things got even stranger. Of course, the phantom calls kept coming, but other things would happen that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One example was when I was working in a room that had recently had a code blue. The patient didn't make it. I was trying to work out why we couldn't get any PCs to connect to the network in that room. The fluke said the portal had a connection and was on the generic VLAN. The original PC was re-imaged several times, so it obviously had a perfect working Ethernet card. And we even putting a brand new PC in there. While I was troubleshooting, the door suddenly slammed shut. They opened inwards, and I had it wide open, so you literally had to be in the room to shut the door. The room got instantly chilly, and the thing that made me nope out of there as quickly as possible was when I saw a depression form on the bed, as if someone had sat on it. The nurses and patient techs in the nurses' station had a good laugh at my expense over that one. I came running out and just left my cart with all my tools on it, telling them I'm gonna need someone to go get my stuff out that room because I ain't going back by myself. I've had many other strange experiences at that hospital, and especially at the one I currently work at as a project manager. The top floor of the oldest building on our current campus was at one time basically an apartment for the founding doctor. It's now used as office space, so there are typically only folks there from 9 to 5 during the week. The head of security for the hospital told me they would often get calls from that floor even when no one was there. It's also important to understand that you can only access that floor by swiping your badge in the elevator. Very few people outside of those offices have that kind of access. Anyway, I got a message to come to the security office by one of the security guards because they had a call coming in from there. This was at 6 p.m. So I ran over there. It's important to note that IT and the security observation room/switchboard are right next to one another. They waited for me to get there and to answer it on speaker. There was what I can only describe as a far-off voice that was somewhat obscured by static.
Despite that, it was easy to make out what the voice was saying. "Help me, I'm lost," it repeated over and over again until they hung up. They said that always came through when the call came. They also always sent someone to check, and of course it was always empty. I never directly saw anything up there myself, but I was setting up a laptop docking station for a new director and was alone. It certainly felt like I wasn't, almost like I was being watched. We have a sky bridge to an adjacent children's hospital for emergencies that our NICU is not equipped to handle. I've heard the cry of a baby in that hallway when both doors were shut. Fortunately, I was with two of my other techs and they heard it too, so we know that we weren't just hearing things. Finally, the most recent thing was in the dialysis unit. The whole floor is for renal patients, and they have a big dialysis room up there. I was refreshing a PC in one of the rooms. There was a patient in there, but they were pretty out of it, so I wasn't bothering them. I suddenly heard the door open, which was weird because it was already open. I turned around and saw a nurse walk in, and I was taken aback because she was dressed in a white skirt outfit. If you don't know, modern nurses wear scrubs and would be sent home if they even attempted to wear a skirt. Well, she never said a word to me. She walked over to the patient, looked him over, and then it looked like she fluffed his pillow a bit. Then she strolled out the room without ever saying a word to me or even acknowledging my existence. When I poked my head out the door, she was gone. After I had finished what I was doing, I went to the charge nurse to ask her, and her response chilled me. "Oh, you saw her? No one's seen her in over a month. We were kinda hoping she'd move on." I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that was the gist of it. Apparently this ghost nurse who checks in on patients is well known in that ward.
It was a slow night at the hospital, the kind where the halls feel too empty, the air too still. The nurse sat at the desk, half listening to the faint hum of machines and distant beep of monitors. It was past midnight, the kind of hour where exhaustion made shadows seem longer and silence felt heavier. Then the double doors at the end of the hallway swung open. A man in white nursing garbs walked in. There was nothing unusual about him at first glance, standard scrubs, unremarkable face, steady stride. But something about the way he moved made the nurse pause. There was no urgency, no acknowledgement of anyone. He walked past the desk without a glance, straight into an empty patient room, and never came out. Minutes passed. The nurse frowned, watching the closed door. No light flicked on inside, no sound, no movement, just an empty room that now had someone in it. But something didn't feel right. Pushing away from the desk, the nurse walked over to peek inside. The room was empty. Completely undisturbed, bed still made, bathroom door wide open, no one in there. The air had a heavy stillness, like it hadn't been touched in hours. The nurse stepped back. There was no other exit, no windows that opened, no way out but the door that she had been watching the entire time, and a cold prickle crept up the back of the neck. Moving quickly now, they turned and pushed the double doors open, scanning the hallway beyond. Two respiratory techs stood there deep in conversation. "Hey," the nurse said, trying to keep their voice even. "Did you see a guy in white scrubs come through here a minute ago?" Both techs frowned, and one shook their head. "We've been standing here for the past 20 minutes. No one's come through those doors." A chill swept over the nurse, settling deep in their bones. They knew what they had seen. They hadn't looked away, hadn't dozed off. Someone walked in, someone went into that room, and never came out. Shaken, they went back to the desk and waited for one of their co-workers to return from lunch. When she did, they shared what happened, trying to laugh it off, trying to make sense of it. She didn't laugh, but sighed. "Oh, that's just Bob." The casualness of it made the nurse's skin crawl. Leaning in, she lowered her voice. "Bob worked here years ago and got accused of molesting a kid. It was bad. He knew they were coming for him, so one night he went into that room, opened the window, and jumped. They say he died on impact, and that he never really left." The nurse felt something shift in the air around, like unseen eyes settling on their back. "We see him all the time. Guess tonight was your turn." This happened around 7 or 8 years ago. I got into an accident involving a sharp bamboo stick which struck my face, leaving a scar similar to Luffy from the One Piece anime. But after the accident, I had to undergo surgery and stayed in the hospital for several days. About 2 days into my stay, a new nurse came to me. I was surprised because I hadn't seen her before. She introduced herself as the new nurse who would take care of me during my stay. The first thing she did was check my vitals like a regular nurse. However, her stethoscope was warm, really warm, not the usual cold ones. I asked her about it and she told me it was normal, so I ignored it. Then she gave me some medicine, saying I needed to take it to get better. I told her I'd already taken some earlier, but she said it was time to take this one. When I took it, I noticed it was sweet and not bitter at all. She said she needed to tend to other patients, then left. Not long after, another nurse came in and asked why I wasn't asleep. I told her about the new nurse who gave me medicine, but she said no new nurse had been assigned to the night shift yet. She brushed it off, saying I must have hallucinated it, then helped me fall asleep by singing me a lullaby. The next night at around 2 a.m., the same nurse visited me again. She checked on me, gave me a meal along with the sweet medicine, and this routine continued on to the third day. But then instead of feeling healthier, I started losing weight rapidly. I ignored the other nurses when they tried to give me food or medicine, insisting I was already full, even though my body was visibly weaker. This behavior upset the nurses, and even the doctors grew concerned. They questioned me about why I refused their food and medicine. Finally, I told them the new nurse who gave me food and sweet medicine at 2 a.m. I even told them her name, but none of them knew a nurse by that name. They insisted no one worked at that hospital under that name. They urged me to take their food and medicine, so I reluctantly complied. But the mysterious nurse came back at 2 a.m. She would tell me stories about how I could become healthy again and promised to take me to a beautiful place full of flowers where I'd be happy. And I believed her. Eventually, my parents found out about this nurse. They brought in an exorcist and a priest to bless the hospital, thinking it could be an evil spirit. They even brought 3 new nurses into my room, asking if one of them was the mysterious nurse. I told her no because the nurse I was talking to was incredibly beautiful. The exorcism didn't work. The nurse kept showing up, and the hospital staff decided to check on me every hour to prevent her from disturbing me, especially around 2 a.m. This stretched my stay from 1 week to 2, filled with painful, bitter medication. The priest visited me every 3 days, which was exhausting as well, and after all of that I didn't see the mystery nurse again, until the very last day. As I was leaving the hospital, I saw her in an empty office. She smiled and said goodbye to me. What do you guys think? Do you think it was some kind of evil nurse trying to poison me? I'm not entirely sure what to make of it myself, and I'd love your opinion. I'm a nurse and I work with geriatric patients, and there was an incident about 3 years ago that I still can't fully explain. It was a night shift and I was exhausted. My body felt heavy, my eyelids drooped, and I know I wouldn't make it through the rest of my shift without a quick nap. I decided to skip lunch and sleep in my car for 30 minutes. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the door, wrapped myself in my sweater, and set a timer on my phone. The moment I closed my eyes, I was out. Then, in my dream, I was still sitting there in the car. Everything looked exactly the same. The faint hum of the night shift outside, it felt too real. A sharp tapping on my window jolted me. I turned my head, and standing outside, staring at me through the glass, was one of my patients, Annie. My stomach dropped. She was barefoot in her nightgown, her frail hands trembling at her sides, but her eyes were what unsettled me the most. I fumbled to unlock the door. Annie, what the hell are you doing out here? I'm looking for my daughter. A wave of confusion washed over me. Annie's daughter hadn't visited in years. It's late. Come back inside. We'll call her in the morning. Her face twisted, lips curled in frustration. Then without warning, she slammed her hands against the glass. The whole car shook. My breath hitched in my throat. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond.
My hands, my legs paralyzed. A deep, familiar dread settled over me. Sleep paralysis. I knew what was happening, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. Annie kept pounding on the window harder, her nails scraping against the glass. "I have to find her!" I fought to wake up, forcing my fingers to twitch, my toes to move, anything to break free. Finally, with a violent jolt, I snapped back to reality. I gasped for air, heart pounding. My sweater was damp with sweat. The car was silent. No Annie, no banging on the window. Just the empty parking lot under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Shaken, I rolled down the window to cool off, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. Just a dream. It was just a dream. But when I clocked back in, I noticed a small group of nurses huddled outside one of the rooms with their faces tight with concern. My supervisor spotted me and waved me over. I braced myself for bad news. Maybe a fall, equipment issue, but instead she spoke 5 words. "Annie passed away just now." It took a moment for the words to register. My chest tightened, my skin prickled with goosebumps. I never told anyone about my dream. Maybe it was just a coincidence, my mind playing tricks on me because she was the last patient I had seen before my break. Maybe. But even now, I can't forget the way she looked at me through that glass.
I work as a caregiver in private homes. Most of my 6+ years of experience is with young adults with disabilities, but I cared for an elderly client in a hospice. I've had 2 instances with her that were more eerie than scary, but I'll let you be the judge. This elderly lady, Mrs. Robinson, lived with her daughter and son-in-law. She couldn't be left unattended for safety reasons, so they hired me part-time so they'd have time to go for errands and to appointments and the like. Occasionally they'd ask me to stay with Mrs. Robinson for a few hours in the evening so they could go watch their grandson's band show or something similar. One evening I was staying with Mrs. Robinson for a few hours. She was sleeping in a hospital bed set up in the living room, and I was reading a book by lamplight when I heard muttering. I looked at Mrs. Robinson and saw her lips move while her eyes stayed shut. I chalked it up to sleep talk and went back to my book. I heard the muttering again, and that time I could make out some words in Spanish. That surprised me. In the month I'd worked with her, I'd only ever heard her speak in English. I glanced over at her again and nearly had a heart attack. She was staring in my direction, but I couldn't rightly say what she was staring at. It was more that she was looking through me with the most dead-eyed vacant stare I'd ever seen. There was no life behind that look. It was downright eerie. I stared at her for what felt like an eternity, the whole time she was muttering in Spanish, a language that as far as I knew she didn't speak. I suddenly became aware of the fact that I was alone in the dark in an unfamiliar house, and keenly regretted being so into horror. I approached her to see if she needed anything, as she was bedbound and it was my job, so I asked if she was okay and needed anything, but she didn't respond other than repeating a few phrases in Spanish. I'm not fluent in Spanish. I picked up enough to piece together that she kept asking where her children were, and with the help of my meager Spanish vocabulary in Google Translate, I managed to assure her that all her kids were safe and asleep. And after telling her this, she went back to sleep. I asked later and found out that Mrs. Robinson was actually born in the northern part of Mexico and moved to Texas as a young woman. That explained how she knew Spanish, though at the moment I thought the phrase speaking in tongues crossed my mind. The second incident happened 6 months later. Mrs. Robinson's daughter had moved her hospital bed from the living room into a spare room, and she was sleeping in there. I was in the living room and got up to check on her when I heard her talking. I stopped at the door to listen for a moment, and it sounded like she was talking to a pet, most likely a dog by her words. I actually checked to see if the 2 small dogs in the house were in the room, but it was just her. I asked her who she was talking to, and she told me about her little dog. I smiled and nodded along until she dozed off again. When her daughter got home, I mentioned the incident to her. The daughter confirmed Mrs. Robinson had a dog exactly like the one I described, and that he had been very special to her.
Mrs. Robinson passed about 2 months after that, and I found out that she had experienced something called deathbed visions. They are quite common among people who are anywhere from months to hours from passing. They usually involve the person in question seeing a loved one, holy figures from their religion, and a bright light coming out of nowhere, or even beloved family pets. These visions are usually comforting to the dying, so caregivers are told not to correct or argue with it. The exact mechanism that causes these visions are unknown. One theory is that the cause might be related to cerebral hypoxia or a lack of oxygen to the brain causing neurons to misfire. Another states it might just be another natural part of dying. Personally, I like to think the spirits of her favorite dog and some close loved ones came to guide her to the other side. I'm a nurse working mainly night shifts in a home for the elderly. There are 2 of us in the building at night. Each has their own floor, and there are 80 elderly in our home. Recently, we've had a lot of palliative patients awaiting death and badly sick. We've also had a few deaths in the last month, which is of course to be expected. As of late, night shifts have become unbearable. Many of our patients scream throughout the night and barely get any sleep, ranting about seeing figures standing over them, or talking to them, calling their names and saying hello. Tonight I was sitting in our little nurse point, in the dark. My desk light turned on, overseeing halls in 3 directions, typing something into my computer. That's when I heard a woman say hello to me. I look up. Everything was still and eerie. I went out and checked the halls, but still nothing. I brushed it off, maybe I was tired, and sat back down. Not a minute passes and someone grabs my shoulder. I jumped out my skin. There was no one behind me, no one near me, and I almost peed myself. I quickly ran down to my co-worker. She was sitting pale in her nurse's station. She looked at me and told me she had heard someone calling her name out of the death room. That's the room where the dead are brought to await funeral services. She said she watched the door, which was tightly shut, slowly open, and then heard the call. Needless to say, we were both scared to death, huddled in the common room, going out to rooms together. If anyone knows anything we can do to calm this entity down, I'd love to hear it. Years before this, I worked as a psych tech, and there was one case that still haunts me. A 7-year-old boy was admitted to our floor because his mother didn't know what to do with him. Sadly, it wasn't uncommon for parents to bring in their children in desperation, even if there wasn't any diagnosed psychological issue. But this case was different. His mother arrived shaking, tears streaking down her face. She had to be led into another room while the boy was admitted. She was genuinely afraid of her own child. The signs had been there for a while. At first, she had just been confused, finding mutilated animals in the backyard, though she never saw coyotes or any predators around. Then the neighbors' smaller pets began disappearing. The boy had an obsession with knives, hiding them all over the house. When confronted, he denied everything, his expression eerily blank. And when he and his mother argued, his reactions escalated, pushing her down, kicking her, whispering threats of ending her life. On multiple occasions, she had woken up in the dead of night to find him standing beside her bed, staring her down, his face completely void of emotion. She began to lock her bedroom door at night, but it still didn't make her feel safe. The last straw was when she flipped up his mattress and discovered more than 50 knives underneath, in varying shapes and sizes. When I first met him, I treated him like any other child in our care. He seemed normal enough. That is until you tried to speak with him. His gaze was empty, as if he was looking through you rather than at you. His responses were robotic, rehearsed, his lips stretching into a grin that never reached his eyes. That smile, cold, dead, void of humanity. He would only smile like that when he got away with something, taking another kid's markers, whispering something cruel under his breath. The staff would catch him, but there was never any remorse, only that eerie, knowing grin. Laying in my bed at night, still get chills remembering him. I believe I met a 7-year-old psychopath, and I do wonder what in the world happened to him. I work in IT in the hospice industry, and one of my workers, a CNA, shared a haunting story from our unit about a patient who passed away. She heard that the family were present as the patient's death was imminent, so she walked into the room. The room was crowded with people, and she had to navigate around them to tend to the patient. She noticed that everyone was dressed in church clothes, suit, and dresses, and after finishing her task, she left the room. 15 minutes later, she returned and found the nurse there alone. Confused, she asked, "Where did everyone go? Where are the family members?" The nurse looked at her and replied, "That patient died in the last 10 minutes. The family is in the waiting area now." Curious, she went to the waiting area and saw only a few family members sitting there in regular clothes. She then checked the other rooms, thinking she might have mistakenly entered the wrong room earlier, but they were empty, with no family members nor patients. It dawned on her that she never really looked at the people in the rooms, never saw their faces clearly, because she's only about 5'2". The realization unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps those she saw were former family members of the patient that were there to welcome her to the other side. I once worked at an assisted living facility that had been converted from an old hotel. The current dining hall used to be an indoor swimming pool, but it was filled in years before the facility opened. There are no traces of the swimming pool in that area anymore. A female resident with dementia would often complain to us about the noise of children playing and splashing in the pool. Another resident whose room was situated directly above the dining hall also frequently mentioned hearing kids' voices and the sound of water. Both were convinced they heard these noises despite the absence of a pool or any children. Additionally, this facility had its own eerie quirks. I often felt as if someone was walking right behind me, but whenever I turned around, no one was there. It was a place full of mysterious and unsettling incidences. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night. Hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. But one night I was mopping the dining room, which had a huge window overlooking the garden. It was around 1 a.m., pitch dark outside and low lighting inside, when I had this horrible feeling of being watched. So I looked up, and reflected in the window was a man behind me wearing a brown suit and bowler hat, with the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around, there was obviously no one there. But I'll never forget that look of evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that, and they've all seen the man. It appears he just enjoys terrorizing these poor people. I worked as a caregiver in an assisted living facility before starting grad school. The facility was private, consisting of 3 different houses, each accommodating 6 residents and 2 staff members. At the beginning of my tenure, all the residents were women. One day, while my coworker and I were in the kitchen preparing lunch, we suddenly heard a loud voice shouting, "Help me, help me." We quickly glanced back and immediately rushed to check on our respective residents. Finding no one in my part of the house, I returned to the kitchen. My coworker stood there wide-eyed with a bewildered expression. I asked her if she had heard the voice too, and she confirmed that she had, but there was no one on her side either. We both turned to look outside and saw all the residents were in the garden enjoying the roses. It was then we both realized the voice we had heard was distinctly male. Later I learnt that before I started working there, a male resident who was a World War II veteran with PTSD had lived in the facility. He often hallucinated and cried out for help before he passed away. Could it have been an echo of his ghost lingering in the assisted living facility?
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I don't know about you, but I find hospitals incredibly scary places. If you have a story, you can submit it to my email or my Reddit. Both links can be found in the description. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. They get some cool extra stuff for signing up, and if you would like some cool extra stuff, feel free to check out what that is. Until next time, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.